A scientific method is a way a scientist would do something, because a method is a way you would do something. A scientist does things scientifically, so it would be a method that a scientist would use.
They're experimental setups or designs where you modify something, you set up an experiment, you hold everything constant, or you try to, you modify one thing, you can do that. And those are very valid, and I think that's the more typical scientific method people are familiar with. We also have mathematical models, all right, and those are really important tools to us for testing how things might vary in a particular system. All right, climate models right now are something that we read a lot about, we hear about in the popular press. Climate models are being used to, say, hold carbon dioxide emissions at present day levels and look at what that's going to have, what the consequences of that will be in the year 2100. So modeling is an approach to the scientific method. I think, is that what you were asking about? That we use models to design experiments, to test ideas, to test hypotheses, and that's a much different approach in many ways conceptually than the going out and observing the trees or setting up an experiment to vary temperature and see what the effect on plant growth might be.
No, probably not. And they're probably going to be coming out with new ideas, and they're probably going to discover different things. So.
The fact that scientific knowledge changes is one of the more interesting and fun parts of science. Scientists are always learning and then revising how we understand the world. And an example of this would be from ocean circulation, is that we used to believe that the ocean was full of these big currents like the Gulf Stream. I think if you look in the literature, they refer to it sometimes as rivers in the ocean. But what we learned is that there is a whole nother part of the ocean circulation called the mesoscale, and these are ocean eddies that have scales on the order of tens to hundreds of kilometers. These are the variable and fluctuating part of the ocean circulation. And it turns out that if you look through the literature, there were observations that suggested that the ocean flow was not steady, because people would measure in the Gulf Stream and they would see velocity measurements that were maybe more than 10 to 15 centimeters per second higher than what they thought the mean flow would be. So what people did is they discounted those measurements because they didn't fit the existing theory and they were thought to be in error, or just an anomalous or an abnormality in terms of measurements. But the more those kinds of data started appearing, and it got harder and harder to discount them, so people then started looking at the ocean at smaller, or observing it at smaller scales, and those scales are called the mesoscale. And then that showed that the ocean is full of eddies, and eddies are the equivalent of the atmospheric storms that we have, the big frontal systems and cyclones and anticyclones in the atmosphere. Those exist in the ocean, and now we understand that the ocean, most of the ocean circulation is in these mesoscale events, or mesoscale features. And that has been a huge change in the understanding and theory that we have of ocean circulation. and some of the questions don't really have an answer. And I think that's something that surprised me when I got into science, because if you read the scientific method, you do steps 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and you have an answer. All right, well, that's not the way it really is. You might have part of an answer, but you don't have the full answer. All right, and I think that's something that I had to learn when I started this, was that I'll never know the answer. I'm only going to incrementally keep pushing at the problem, and over the course of my career, I will make contributions to the problem, but I'm not going to have the answer to it. Right now, a real important area of development is to look at the interface between human and natural systems. All right, and that is becoming an incredibly important area of research, maybe, is how do you put the human into the models that we're developing to understand the natural system. I develop and use ecosystem models for marine systems. Okay, I want to know how you go from a nutrient all the way up to a whale. Those are called end-to-end models in marine ecosystems. How do you understand the total marine food web? The human part comes because people impact the upper levels of that food web by taking fish out, all right, by extracting resources. So how do you then say, how am I going to put into my marine ecosystem model a human that has a behavior that's being dictated by whatever society demands are on that person or group of people or corporations or whatever? How do then I allow for policy, human behavior, human interactions to be part of what is determining the productivity of this marine food web that I'm interested in? That's a very important area right now because it's at the interface of the human and natural systems where we're going to have to make some very hard decisions about how we use our natural resources in the future, particularly with the climate change that we know will be happening. All right, and that's ethics. How do you deal with the tragedy of the commons? You know, those kinds of things, and allow that to be a driver of marine ecosystems, or any ecosystem for that matter, terrestrial or marine, anyone that's exploited. I think it's the real issue here.